My name is Eric Rice, and I am chair of the Department of Counseling and Educational Studies here at the School of Education. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the 2020 version of the Chair's Speaker Series. So I'd like to quickly acknowledge my fellow chairs, Yolanda Abel from Advanced Studies in Education, and Mary Ellen Badio-Farrell from the Department of Innovative Teaching and Leadership. Tonight is a really special night for me. We have Gloria Ladson-Billings joining us, and her work was some of the most important work in getting my career started in education. She is the Professor Emerita and former Kellner Family Distinguished Professor in Urban Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and also a faculty affiliate in multiple departments: Educational Policy Studies, Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis, and Afro-American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's currently serving as president of the National Academy of Education. She was also the 2005 to 2006 president of the American Educational Research Association. And her research examines the pedagogical practices of teachers who are successful with African-American students. And she also investigates critical race theory applications to education and is responsible for bringing the term education debt to the field of education and replacing the achievement gap, which is going to be part of her talk tonight. She's the author of many critically acclaimed books, including The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African-American Children, over 100 journal articles and book chapters. She's been an editor, and she's won more awards than I can count. But she's well recognized for her work in education and for her service. Where she has an active community life and serves on many community boards, and is an active member of her church, and is named to one of the church's board of deacons as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce Gloria Ladson-Billings, who will speak tonight on the education debt, improving student outcomes in the midst of pandemics.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you to the Johns Hopkins School of Education community. I'm delighted to be here. Eric, I feel like you and I are old friends because we've been together for the last 2 days pretty regularly. But as Eric mentioned, I'm going to talk about the education debt and the notion of improving student outcomes in the midst of pandemics. You got a bit of an introduction as to who I am. As Eric mentioned, I am Professor Emerita at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. That's a fancy way of saying I'm retired, but I have a library card and 24 parking privileges each year. So it's actually a pretty sweet deal. I am also the current president of the National Academy of Education. And in a non-COVID-19 year, I would get to Washington at least 3 times a year for our annual meetings and our fellows forums. The Academy is the place that sponsors the Spencer Doctoral Dissertation Fellowships, as well as the Spencer Postdocs. I am currently a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And every year something has come up to keep me from actually going through my induction. And this year is no different because the inductions are going to be virtual. And I am a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. So that's kind of who I am in the academy, but I think it's also important for you to know where I'm from. So although I am talking to you from Madison, Wisconsin, and have lived in Madison for 29 years, I am originally from Philadelphia, just up the road, 92 miles to be exact, from Baltimore. I grew up in Philadelphia. I went to school there, kindergarten through 12th grade, and I taught there in the school district of Philadelphia for 10 years. But in between graduating high school and becoming a teacher, I spent 3.5 of the best years of my life right there in Baltimore at Morgan State University. So you should recognize that lovely picture of Holmes Hall with Frederick Douglass standing in front of it. Morgan as the national treasure. So I have a very special relationship with Baltimore, and I would be coming back for homecoming next month if it weren't for COVID-19. I also spent some time at the University of Washington in Seattle. And so you can see a picture, what is affectionately called in Seattle, the fountain and the mountain. So there is a particular place you can stand on that campus where you see that water fountain. And if you look in the distance, you will see a beautiful horizon of Mount Rainier. It's almost like a scoop of ice cream. But the cruel joke is you probably only see it 2 or 3 times in the course of a year because the sky's so gray in Seattle. Most of the time you don't get a good view of Mount Rainier. And then finally, there is a picture of the church and Old Union area of Stanford University, and Stanford in Palo Alto, California is where I did my dissertation. So those are kind of places that I think of myself as being from because of having spent time there. And so today I really want to talk to you though about this whole notion of education debt and pandemics. I want to talk about what I call a tale of 4 pandemics. And some of you are now scratching your heads. What do you mean 4 pandemics? We've got COVID-19. That's pandemic enough for us. And indeed, that's the one that most people are used to when you say the word pandemic. The novel coronavirus coming out of Wuhan, China, and then through Italy, and eventually into the US. But that's not the only pandemic. We also have a pandemic of anti-Black racism that resulted in the horrific death of George Floyd. And that death, that 8 minutes and 46 seconds in which Officer Chauvin knelt on his neck is kind of seared into the memories of many Americans. And, you know, I think some people ask, well, you know, we've had these police killings and shootings of unarmed Black citizens before. Why did this one galvanize us? Well, I think a couple things happened. Number one, it happened at a time when we had no other distractions. We were mostly under stay-at-home orders. So we weren't going out. We weren't, the sports had been pretty much shut down. We had no distractions. We were able to just look at this event. And I believe this, the filmmaker Ava DuVernay, who said, one of the reasons why this particular death captures us, it's one of the few times in which the frame, and of course she's speaking as a filmmaker, but the frame catches both the victim and the perpetrator. We see both Mr. Floyd and Officer Chauvin in the same frame, and it's just something very powerful about that image. But there's a third pandemic that is waiting in the wings, and that is the economic one. We are headed for some fairly bad times. I think yesterday Disney announced that they were laying off 24,000 workers. I have friends and acquaintances who have lost jobs. The airline, folks who work with the airlines are just sort of trembling, waiting for another shoe to drop. We're worried about what that means for the housing situation. Here in Madison, we're already seeing tents being erected for people who are unhoused. So that's a third pandemic. And I'm telling you about all of these things because our students are going to be in the midst of all of them and have to deal with them. And then the fourth one that I think we kind of know about intellectually, but we tend to brush over it, but it is becoming more and more apparent, and that is climate catastrophe. The fact that the entire West Coast has been impacted by out of control fires and still fires that are not under control. Quality of the air, and some of that air and smoke has come all the way across the country into the upper Midwest and New York. It's not just something that's happening because we didn't clean the forest floors. We're seeing more of these things happen. Last year, they happened in Australia. And having been to Australia several times, I realize it's a pretty vast piece of land, but it impacted cities. So friends of mine in places like Melbourne and Sydney talked about how bad the quality of air was for them. The fact that they had so many animals whose habitats were really extinguished by this. So all of these things are happening at one time. They are, quote, pandemic in that they're happening not just here, but across the globe. Even the anti-Black racism is happening in places like the UK and in France and in Italy. So if all of these things are happening, what is it that we can say about pandemics? Well, I want to share with you a statement from an Indian essayist by the name of Arundhati Roy. And she says that pandemics are actually portals, that they are a dividing line between the old and the new. And so taking this quote from an article that she's written called "The Pandemic as a Portal," which you can find pretty readily online. I would suggest you read the entire article. She's really talking about India. But here's what the last part of the essay says. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So in some ways, Roy is suggesting that the pandemic can be a space of opportunity. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the education debt and then try to move us toward this notion of opportunity by posing a set of questions that I hope you will be willing to engage. This notion of the education debt actually comes from my 2006 presidential address to the American Educational Research Association. So you can either find the article itself online, you can find me giving the speech online on AERA's website, but it's an idea that I sat with for over a year as president of the American Educational Research Association. And it came to me as I was sitting in a cab on my way to the airport, to LaGuardia Airport in New York. And I saw the billboard with the sign with our national debt. Now, what you can't see in just this still photo is that the numbers are moving upward quickly. And while I was sort of stuck in traffic, I looked at that line. And so this is a current one. I think at the time that I saw it, it was something like 14 trillion. But this is $20 trillion of debt. And what really struck me is the second line. Now it's a much smaller number, but the caption says, your family share. So you can see that your family share of this debt is $372,440. I don't know about you, but I don't have that kind of money to pay this debt down. But that notion of the debt really stuck with me, and I wondered, wow, why did I feel so compelled? And in fact, many political candidates will run on a platform in which they talk about the need to pay down the debt, and we cannot keep passing this debt on to our children. And so what made the debt an appropriate metaphor and an analogy for what I think is happening to students in school was the collective responsibility that we all seem to take on whenever we talk about the debt. So I tried to switch the discourse because I think when you can change the language, you can change minds. I wanted to move from achievement gaps to the notion of an education debt. When we talk about an achievement gap, we typically end up placing the onus on the students. We place it on their parents. We might place it on their culture. And sometimes we place it on individual teachers, that the teachers are not doing their job. But it presumes that the crux of the problem that students are experiencing is school achievement. Doing that ignores the other gaps. We have health gaps. In fact, I was giving a talk and for superintendents once, and one of the superintendents actually came from Montgomery County, Maryland. Now, you guys are in Baltimore, so you know Montgomery County. You know it's a pretty nice place to live. And this superintendent indicated, you know, he was very apologetic for being late. He said, I had to go to a student's funeral. Now, the minute he said that, remember I told you I'm from Philadelphia, so I'm assuming if you're going to a student funeral, then there's been some sort of violence that has happened to this student. This kid's been shot or whatever. But when I had a chance during the break to speak to the superintendent, you know, and express my condolences, I was shocked to learn that this 15-year-old had not died from gun violence or even, you know, any kind of violence. He died because he had a mouthful of dental caries, that is cavities, never having gone to the dentist. And one of those cavities got infected, abscessed and got infected. And that infection spread through this child's body and killed him. Not in Bangladesh, okay, not in Lahore, India, but in Montgomery County, Maryland. So we have health gaps that we don't talk about. In fact, Richard Rothstein, who is an economist of education, says that if we really cared about our children, we would stop having these frivolous arguments about reading wars or math wars, whole language versus phonics. And he said, that's not the point. If we really cared about them, we would make sure they all had health care. Because far too many of our children are not healthy enough to be able to take advantage of anything we have to offer them in school. Isolating this notion of an achievement gap also ignores the wealth gap. There is a difference between wealth and income, yet we mostly use income as a marker to determine where people are. So we say, for example, well, middle-class Black kids aren't doing as well as middle-class white kids. Well, what are we calling middle class? So let me pick a number. Let's say it's earning $75,000 a year in a household for four, you know. If that $75,000 is being earned by one wage earner and the other wage earner is at home with children and available to schools, that's very different than two wage earners who have a combined income of $75,000. It's still $75,000, but there's nobody home to help kids. There's two people working really hard, making a little better than $30,000. So income can be misleading. What wealth is the ability to transfer money intergenerationally. I live in a community in which, you know, it's a very nice community in Madison, but I always say to my husband, this is our last home. We're not buying any more homes. This is the place we finally got to. But I have a lot of young white neighbors. And for them in this neighborhood, it's their first home. And when I've had a chance to converse with them about their decision to buy a home in this neighborhood and, you know, why did you decide to move over here? You know, I get a very typical, well, it's a nice neighborhood, wonderful parks nearby, there's a good school. We heard that the neighbors are very friendly. And then I might probe a little bit and say, wow, you must have been saving a long time to be able to buy a home here. Well, I know they haven't been saving a long time because they're not that old. What they almost always say is, well, no, not really. Our parents gave us the down payment. That's wealth, the ability to transfer money intergenerationally. I can tell you that even when African Americans are solidly middle class, a lot of times their wealth transfer is in the other direction. They're not transferring to children, but they're transferring to elderly parents who need assistance because Social Security isn't enough to help them make ends meet. There's a huge wealth gap between Blacks and whites and Latinx and whites. And we also ignore the gap in teacher quality. The fact that it is much more likely for children who go to school with mostly Black and brown classmates are going to have a teacher who is either underprepared or unprepared to teach them, particularly in STEM areas of mathematics and science. So these gaps are all happening, and we keep kind of pointing towards the student as having these achievement gaps, as if other things weren't happening. So we're not looking at this larger context. I want to take a minute really to make a distinction to help people understand really when I say debt, what I'm talking about. There is a difference between a deficit and a debt. So when we talk about it in macroeconomics, we're talking about what's happening in the nation. The deficit is the difference between the flow of government spending and the flow of government revenues. Now, what that means is that when the Congress agrees on a budget, they almost already know that they are not going to have enough money for what they intend to spend. They actually build what we call deficit budgets. It's something that states are not allowed to do. States have to do balanced budgets. So that's why when you get hit with a budget impact with the state, those cuts are pretty severe because they have to have that budget balance. But the federal government doesn't. They can spend more than they take in because they have the ability to borrow. And in fact, that gets into the next concept, debt. So deficit is that year to year, we made a budget, but we don't have enough, we're not going to get enough money to cover it. But debt is the total that the nation owes. It's the sum that it borrowed to cover the last year's deficit and all the deficits in years past. Now, it's not new for the nation to have a debt. We've had debts that have gone back to the 1700s. But to have these debts as large as they are now, into the trillions, is unheard of. So the deficit is what happens every year when they do the budget thing. The debt is the accumulation of all of these budget shortfalls. So if you were to actually look at the US budget and look at what we spend most of the money on, the number one thing we spend money on is defense. So all of the tanks and the bombs and the missiles and the fighter jets and the US armed services, that's the number one thing we spend our money on. The second thing we spend our money on is what people call entitlement. So we are then talking Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But the third thing in the US budget is debt service. In other words, we are paying the interest on all this debt. It's the third thing we spend our money in. So it's a big deal that we have to keep paying this debt. So let's talk then about the academic analogy. I see these yearly test scores, these achievement test scores, those are deficits. Every year we sit the students down, they take the test, they fall short of what we had expected. It's creating a deficit. But the debt, in my mind, is the accumulation of the factors that contribute to the lack of the achievement progress. So let's talk about what those factors, those debt factors are. Well, one of the first ones I want to talk to you about is the historical debt. We didn't just start not providing quality education for Black children, brown children, indigenous children. Indeed, it was against the law for Black people to be permitted to read or write. When they were enslaved, they couldn't, if you were a white citizen, if you taught a Black child or a Black person to read or write, you could be prosecuted for that. Or if a Black person was found to have been able to read or write, they could be lynched for that. So now all of a sudden you want to tell them, oh, you better learn to read. Trust me, we have a sort of historical notion of you shouldn't read. You're not worthy of being able to read. And in fact, Maryland's own Frederick Douglass, a part of his narrative is how he tricked some white boys in the neighborhood where he was enslaved to teach him how to read. So they weren't permitted to read or write. The second thing that's a part of this historical debt is that we've had these separate and substandard schools for a very long time. In the South, we called it de facto because the South set up a separate school district. In the North, we call it, in the South, we call it de jure because the law set up a separate school district that Blacks could not attend. In the North, we called it de facto. We said, it's just a matter of the fact. That's kind of what that Latin phrase means. But really what it is that third bullet point there, that the housing policies that were set up denied African Americans access to quality schools. So you have policies that are redlining, do not allow Black people to live in certain neighborhoods. And last year I gave a talk at the Teachers College entitled something like, "It's All de jure," in which I argued that the North doesn't have clean hands in this. They also enacted laws to create separate schools. It's just that their laws are enacted around the housing, but it has the same effect. And then finally, the whole issue of underprepared and unqualified teachers, that this has been a very long-standing set of circumstances for the education of Black people. And there's certainly other examples. We could go into all of the litigation and the court cases that have worked against Black students getting a fair and decent education. Another part of this debt is economic. The school districts where the majority of students enrolled are students of color receive something like $23 billion less in education funding than those in predominantly white school districts, despite serving the same number of students. This is a dramatic discrepancy that underscores the depth of the K-12 funding inequities in the US. So, one of the things that students will see is if they ever cross county lines, for example, how much larger and brighter and well-equipped schools are outside of where they live. We are not willing to spend money on poor children, and we're certainly not willing to spend it on poor Black children. We also know because the way we fund our schools is through property taxes, and the value of the property in poor communities is less. There is less money to be extracted. The other thing that happens often in these suburban districts is that they have not only higher property taxes for individual homes, but they're able to tax entities such as shopping malls. Now think about that. The shopping malls will pay a tax that go into the municipality's coffers. But poor folks drive out to those shopping malls too, because they're not really great places to shop where they live. So when they come out there and they purchase goods and services, they pay taxes for that. So they pay the taxes in their own city, which don't produce very much in terms of their schools, but they also help subsidize the schools in the suburban communities where they have to go and shop. So in some ways, it's, in my mind, it's like a rigged game. The third aspect of the debt is socio-political. The 15th Amendment finally granted the franchise to all male citizens, but we all know that we're only talking about a certain group of male citizens. The 19th Amendment granted that franchise to women. I hope you have been able to watch the series that PBS has that broadcast for most of the summer. I think last night I watched the final episode celebrating the 100th anniversary of women getting the vote. But the third bullet there points out that neither of those amendments guaranteed Blacks the right to vote. And right now we are looking at a rollback of voting rights where, you know, I think something like, wow, almost 30% of Blacks in Florida are unable to vote because of felony convictions. Now they passed this measure 4 to say, you know what, if someone has already served their time, if they're no longer on paper, that is, they're not on parole or probation, let them vote. Well, that passed overwhelmingly in Florida last year or year before. But now what has happened is the legislature says, well, you can't vote until you've made restitution. So if that isn't a poll tax, I don't know what is. So you've got these people, they have to pay thousands of dollars in order to be able to secure the vote. So not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so this is within my lifetime, that Blacks were assured voting rights. It means that not until the 20th century could Blacks even select local officials like their school board members. So you're saying, oh, they don't participate, or they, you know, they're not interested, they don't care about education. If you can't even vote for the people who will represent you, why would you care about these things? So that debt is social political. And then the final aspect of the debt, which is perhaps the one that is not empirical, that I cannot show you the data on, that I'm still going to make a case for, is I believe that the debt is moral, that some things are just not right. They are not ethical, they are not moral. And denial of full citizenship is one of those things. That's immoral. You know, if I am a human being in your society, I'm paying taxes, I am contributing to the body politic, but you don't let me do the basic civic things. You're working against my right to vote. I have trouble getting housing. I experience discrimination and all kinds of other things. It's immoral. So redlining and discriminatory housing policy is immoral, and we know it still happens. The inability to access quality health care is immoral. In this COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that became very evident is that Black and brown people were dying at a far greater rate. I talked to a friend of mine who was a nurse in California, and she's still not over the fact that there was an immigrant family that came into the emergency room, the mother and the father and the children. And both parents were suffering from COVID-19, and they were far gone. And the reason they didn't come in before is because they were undocumented and they were afraid. And so they eventually, both of them died, leaving these children as orphans. This is immoral. We shouldn't be doing this. And then finally, the differential treatment in the justice system is immoral. I don't have to rehash the Breonna Taylor situation, but for someone to be convicted or charged with shooting the wall, but no one charged of shooting the person, suggests to me that the justice system is very, very unequal. So I hope that kind of lays the frame for you of how I'm making this argument that we're not talking gaps here. We're talking a very big debt. So I want to switch a little bit and get us back to this notion of the pandemics. I put this slide up here because every one of us has one of these devices at the ready. They're either in our pocket, in our purses, sitting on our desktops. They've become ubiquitous in our lives. And because they are devices, they are machines, they don't always work. And sometimes you get to a place where your phone just won't do what you need it to do. You try all kinds of little tricks. You turn it off, you turn it on, you leave it alone for a while. You go online and you pull up, see if you can find a support group. Somebody else has the same problem. But at some point you decide, you know what, I gotta go back to the store. Now I just happen to have Apple here, but it doesn't have to be the Apple store. It could be an Android store. You could go back to LG or Google or, you know, whoever does your phone for you. And you're going to probably encounter someone who's all of 17 years old in a t-shirt who will tell you the dreaded words, your phone needs a hard reset. Nobody wants to hear that. Because what they're really telling you is that unless you've backed up all your stuff, your contacts and your pictures and how far you got in the Candy Crush game and all that kind of stuff, they're going to give you back a phone that looks a lot like it did when it came from the factory. And I like this metaphor to describe what we are now faced with in our schooling in the midst of these pandemics. Go back to Arundhati Roy's point that we can go into this new world without all that baggage. Well, if we have a hard reset and we don't worry about all the stuff we used to do, we can be thinking about a hard reset for our schools. This isn't a new idea. There are some lessons from history. I have two pictures there for you to see. One on the left is post-war Japan. And what happened after World War II in Japan, they decided, you know, that first of all, they were occupied by the US and Allied forces, but they decided we can't spend money on defense because the terms of the Geneva Agreement don't allow us to. We can't build another army again. And it's probably not a good thing to build one anyway. We need to put our resources into our schools, and we need to rethink how we've done our schools, because if what we do in schools help produce what we got that got us in all of this mess to begin with, we need to do some new things. So one of the new things that they decided was to be more expansive and include more girls, because they weren't paying any attention to the education of girls before World War II. So they switched that up. They also did some organizational changes. And so rather than just have the elementary secondary split, they looked to the US and realized that you could do an elementary, a middle grade, and a high school that probably developmentally made more sense. So they did a hard reset. They didn't say after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, oh, let's start school again. And when you get to school, let's just turn to page 27. There was a lot of thinking about how can we do this thing better? How can we do it over? How can we start again? The picture on the right is a picture from Italy. And again, it's post-war. Italy fighting with the Axis alongside of Germany and Japan also realized something that we are doing is very wrong. We have created people who don't know how who are either fascists or don't know how to stand up in the face of fascism. And we need to think very differently about that. So what you're seeing in that picture is a picture of the Reggio Emilia preschool. Now, those of you who are in early education know that Reggio Emilia is all the rave. We send our teacher preparation candidates to see this in, really novel way of thinking about educating young children. They did a hard reset because of what they had experienced. So for us, maybe the microcosm of the hard reset is Katrina. Katrina destroyed almost everything in New Orleans and laid bare the incredible inequities of that system. I wrote an article for a journal called Visions in Urban Education entitled Now They're Wet. And what I was trying to argue is that New Orleans had bad housing, bad health, underemployment, and bad schools before the hurricane. What's different now is now they're wet. The problem, I think, is that everybody was so concerned about, quote, getting back to normal. That's something that I don't want to happen in this post-pandemic America. I don't want to go back to normal, because if you remember, normal meant the kids who are most vulnerable are again assigned to the lowest groups. The kids who are most vulnerable are misidentified for things like special needs services. The kids who are most vulnerable are more likely to be suspended. The kids who are most vulnerable are going to fail those tests. I don't want to go back to normal, because normal was where the problem was. What happened with Katrina, there was this notion of let's go back to normal, but there was another group of folks who are sort of neoliberal in their outlook and thought about marketization of our schools. And they put together a plan that they were able to slide in under the people who were sitting around saying, let's get back to normal. And now what you have in have in New Orleans is a fully charterized school district. That's not what I mean by a reset. I'm thinking we need to think of some creative and innovative ways to make sure that all of our students are educated. But if all we're thinking about is going back to normal, I fear that we will have the same sort of post-Katrina outcome. So I want to wrap up by posing a series of questions of what does all of this mean in a post-pandemic world? So I started out with asking you to remember what happened post-Katrina. But I also want you to think about the changed assumptions that have occurred because of our pandemics. For example, we have now changed assumptions about who can have access to digital devices. Before the pandemics, we were saying, oh, you can't give these kids devices because they'll break them, or they're going to lose them, or they're going to sell them. But now we realize, yeah, we can give it to them, and we did give it to them. Another assumption that maybe has changed is how important are these tests? You know, before the pandemics, we kept saying, oh gosh, you have to give the tests. The tests are important, the test. Well, we made it through a spring without any tests. The world has not collapsed on us. So really, how important are these tests? We also need to be thinking of the role of social emotional learning and mental health needs. And I want to talk more about them a little bit later on some subsequent questions. But I know that the educators that I talk to have spent less time worrying about the kids' academic issues and more about what's happening to them in the midst of all of this isolation and not being able to play with kids their own age and not interact with caring adults outside of the household. And so one of the things that I think needs to happen is we have to try to rethink what we mean by education. Now, mind you, I haven't said schooling, I said education. So let's break this down a little bit, and I'm going to break it down on the lines of what I mean by culturally relevant pedagogy. So the first tenet of culturally relevant pedagogy is around student learning. So what does post-pandemic student learning look like? Well, it asks the question, well, what actually counts as learning? Is it the only thing on the test? Is it just your end of year grades? Or are there other things that count in learning? You know, I've heard people say over and over about, oh, the kids have COVID slide, they have the summer slide, they have learning, lost learning. Truth of the matter is, if you know anything about human development, human beings are always learning. And in fact, from what I could see, the way that our youth were in the streets and leading some of the civic protests, they're learning a lot. They're not learning school-based subjects, but they are learning. So what will count as learning in a post-pandemic environment? How do we determine what students know versus what they have? And, you know, I use this example of the science fair project, you know, that's almost looked like a rocket that's about to go off to Mars, that you know that no 9-year-old actually did. The fact that that kid's father is an aerospace engineer has a lot to do with the fact that they have that rocket. So we've got to make a distinction between what they actually know versus what they have. If what they have are 2 college-educated parents, if what they have are resources, are we giving them credit for that? or are we giving them credit for what they know? Can we finally put our tests in proper perspective? And what I mean by that is I'm not an anti-test person. I believe the tests tell us something. I just don't believe they tell us everything. And I don't think whether or not a youngster goes on to the next grade to rise or fall on a one test performance. If indeed tests were the be all end all of everything we do, then the best drivers in our society are 16 years old because they passed the test. But you and I both know that those people cannot drive. So let's think about what the tests actually tell us. And can we measure academic progress versus some fixed external standards? Think for a moment about a youngster who arrives in a 5th grade classroom reading at the 2nd grade level. And think of a teacher who has just moved heaven and earth to improve this youngster's reading. And by the end of the year, this child now reads at the 4th grade level. Remember I said he started at the 2nd, now he reads at the 4th. That teacher was able to make up 2 years of progress. But when it comes time to take the external state mandated tests, he's not going to be at the 5th grade level. And we're not going to give him any credit for moving 2 years. So let's think about the growth score as opposed to just the external standard score. What about the post-pandemic cultural competence? It's time for us to think about the role of youth culture. What is it that our young people are telling us and teaching us? And how do we integrate that into our teaching and learning? What's the role of socioeconomic differences? The fact that you have to be designated as a free or reduced lunch person. One of the things that we did in Madison is we just scrapped that during the pandemic. We said, anybody who wants a lunch, come get a lunch. You don't have to document anything. So there were middle-class kids who went over and said, oh, I think I'll go over to the school distribution place and pick up a lunch. I've seen kids in schools in tears because they had to stand in the free and reduced line. That there is a stigma that's addressed to that. So let's think about that socioeconomic status and what that means for kids. How do we help teachers understand disparity? If our teachers are pretty much drawn from the middle class, what do they know about working class and low income families? Do they know about what it means to have to move in the middle of the month, or to have a car break down on you and not be able to repair it until you get paid 3 weeks later? And then what is the role of digital literacy? This is a place in which we can be in a different relationship with our students because they actually know a lot of this better than our teachers. Okay, and then I'll raise the question of post-pandemic critical consciousness. What questions do we need to engage with our students, with each other, with administrators? Not just mundane questions about curriculum, but about the very nature of our enterprise. Tied to that is, how do we help the public understand our changing needs? They're not the same as they were. They actually weren't the same before the pandemic, but now it's very evident. And so this is a right moment. Let's go back to Arundhati Roy's notion, Arundhati Roy, notion that we are going through a portal, and that we can go through it lightly, and we can also be going into a new world that we're willing to fight for. For what social and emotional learning do we prepare? It's not merely the students who have social and emotional needs. Our teachers have social and emotional needs. They've been through some stuff. In my neighborhood, one of the things that teachers have been doing is riding around with sort of caravans, not to drop off any math packets, not to give students reading materials, but to basically say, we miss you. We're sorry that we can't be together. We still think about you, because that human relationship is so important in the work we do. And then finally, how do we help our students cope? with what I'm calling pandemic trauma, not just social emotional needs, but mental health needs. We have some students who have had to be very up close with death, unexpected death. 200,000 plus people have died in this country. And some of our students in the most vulnerable communities have seen that death. And not only did people die, but we have been deprived of the ritual that we typically participate in to celebrate a life. People call them funerals. In many Black communities, we call them homegoings. We have the ritual when we suggest that person is going home to a heavenly home. But it's also the time when we gather the whole family back together, where we talk about that person and what they meant. And then we make some commitments and vows to each other about how we're going to try to do better and live a better life. Our kids haven't had that ritual, and yet they are expected to come back to school and open up a workbook and just do their work while all of this is heavy on them. So all of those things are happening. I want to close with an example of a student's perspective of how schools operate. And I want to suggest to you that this is an example of how we can think about thinking about what's important in learning and how students can use their voices to tell us what they really need.
We have our national final Raise Up champion, Raise Up winner and champion. His name is Jonathan Williams. He's out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I want y'all to give it up for Jonathan Williams, y'all.
Jonathan Williams, absent. See, I always had the mental capacity and the master key to overcome any academic tragedy, but I had to see and learn from my faults. Because my rotten GPA were where my lessons were taught. I was a 3.6 high achiever up in middle school. No guidance resided in my silence and swimming pools. Didn't appreciate the doggy paddle that I had mastered when Jonathan Williams was absent. Alexander Hamilton High, Milwaukee Public Schools finest. I learned the art of skipping classes and wrote Bueller on my eyelids. Detention room sidekick with some fly kicks and a tight click. Balled up homework in the same fist these students fight with. Jonathan Williams, absent. It was tragic. Amidst good times and laughing, my GPA was dragging against a system not meant for me, mentally in misery. My freshman year stats, 102 days absent. All Fs, 0.0 GPA, cumulative. Swimming pool, doggy paddle. Drowning. I started a movement for improvement, but couldn't dry off with the white towels my teachers threw in. I tried to show my mind can grow like every other student, but people pass on your perspective when your presence also truant. More than a reflection of a freshman year screw up with a blueprint of a ladder, but no tools for me to move up. No electricity, mom and pop's missing, so have them drop out. That's just family tradition. Jonathan Williams, absent. I found a flashlight by the name of Uncle Jeff. Moved in. The floor and 3 pillows were enough for me to stay focused, make sure this hopeless ship stays floating. By my senior year, I was actually a senior. Hey, you know, dressed a little cleaner, professional demeanor. It seems to be I'm on track like Jackie Joyner with 6 medals, fighting my academic debt and my fist medal. But the worst thing you can see when you made it and educated are the people who gave up and them obstacles you evaded. Because I mean, we quicker to give up than you do. I mean, we just like YouTube. We just broadcast ourselves and hope that you like it. Maybe care to comment, because I didn't need to be hooked on phonics. I just needed the people around me to be critical and honest, because we don't know yet that resources and allocated money is the hood's morphine. The only scholarships I knew of was professional sports teams. Now I'm here. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. A scholar and resident, full tuition scholarship and Kappa Alpha Psi president. So I'm saying we can be useless, clueless, ruthless, just a nuisance, worthless, workless, just the worst urban person, but we gotta reconstruct our approach to avoid these different labels and synonyms and help the youth overcome this system that's not meant for them. Thank you.
So I want to give you a little bit of the backstory. Jonathan was my student. That particular piece that you heard was what he turned in for a final presentation in my class. You might have heard him say academic debt. He didn't say gap. And I will also just let you know that Jonathan, that where he was actually delivering the piece, where he's performing the piece that you just saw, was actually in Washington, D.C. at the Raise Up conference, which is a conference designed for students to encourage other students to not drop out of school. And he won that competition. Jonathan has graduated from the University of Wisconsin. He has actually graduated from the University of Florida. He took a year off, went back to Milwaukee to do a year of service with kids in children's theater, and then he headed off to the University of Florida, where he was one of 6 students selected for an outstanding program they have in fine arts, and he completed that, so he has an MFA, and he is now a working actor in Los Angeles, so it has a happy ending. But he told you his story, and he told you the ways that schooling just really wasn't meant for him the way it was organized. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've actually left enough time for us to have some Q&A. So I think Eric is probably in charge of monitoring that. So I'm going to let you do that.
Great, thank you so much for the engaging presentation. I'm going to say a quick word about how we're going to handle the Q&A. I put this into the chat, but just because of the size of the event tonight, we're so excited to have over 300 participants. We are not going to be able to have people, just unmute and ask questions. Instead, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There are a couple questions in there now. You can add your question. You can also, there's a little thumb under each question. You can click on that to upvote that question if someone's already asked your question, and that'll signal to me that it's a question that you really want to hear answered. We have a few coming in there now, so take a look and add your questions. I did want to start with one question, and it's actually related to, it's kind of the opposite in some ways of one of the questions in the chat. So I'm going to try and kind of combine them. But you quoted Arundhati Roy in the presentation saying, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. And I'm really interested in the notion of a reset that you talked about. However, it also potentially makes me nervous. You used the Katrina analogy, and there's a lot of different opinions on that. And the questioner in the chat talks about evidence that shows that the schools are more effective now than in 2005. Students are more likely to finish high school. Learning gaps have noticeably closed over the past decade. And his question is, what lessons from New Orleans are you suggesting should be applied now as recovery from the nationwide pandemic disaster? My question is kind of the opposite. So I'm going to put them together and let you answer them. But for-profit educational companies and other powerful actors have become very adept at using these kinds of ruptures, disaster capitalism, to accumulate capital through dispossession. And they're certainly also looking at what opportunities a post-pandemic world might present for them. So what do you think we can do to make sure that the opportunity to imagine our world anew results in a more equitable distribution of educational opportunity? And how do we take advantage of this to repay some of the education debt rather than allow more debt to accumulate?
So I actually come down closer to your side of the analysis. I do a lot of work in New Orleans. I work with a grassroots group called B NOLA. I've had a couple dissertations come out of post-Katrina And here's what I know. I know, for example, that charter authorization was limited in terms of who could get a charter. We actually, my student who did a brilliant dissertation on this, Kevin Henry, had to get a FOIA order to get access to who they rejected and to be able to see the authorizations. And there were examples of community groups who not only filled out all the paperwork and did all the forms, they almost copied the, sorry, that's my phone. I didn't turn it off. I got to turn it off. That almost copied what was in the educational management organization's charter application, and they still got turned down. So we know that very few community groups got these charter authorizations. The other thing we know was that it is hard to get into a school if you do not already, if you have special needs, if there's any indication that you may not be able to help boost their scores. So kids are constantly being thrown off of these schools like crazy. And then just getting to the schools. So while it's true you hearing from the folks of Tulane and the state telling you that they're doing better compared to what? Compared to what they had? Yeah, the scores are better, but the district is so much smaller. And who has access to schools, I would really encourage people to read Sarah Carr's book, Hope Against Hope, where she looks at, she's a wonderful education journalist who looks at both successes and failures in the post-Katrina era. I'm not a fan of marketizing public schools. I think that they are a part of our public good, and that people shouldn't have to be searching everywhere to find a school that will take their kids.
Thanks for that. By far the most popular question in the Q&A right now comes from Aaliyah Robinson. And it's just, what are some things that you think, it follows, I think, upon that discussion, but what are some things that you think should be implemented in the educational system post-pandemic?
I think we have to pay much more closer attention to our students' social, emotional, and mental health needs. I think one of the things that's happening in Madison, for example, is we had protests too. We had unrest in our downtown area. We had property destroyed. We had day after day of protests. But one of the things that has come as a result of this is we decided to finally take the SROs out of our schools, the security, the police officers. And so that meant the school district now say, we're not a big district. We have 4 comprehensive high schools and 2 alternative high schools. But it means that those schools now have about a $350,000 added back into the budget because they're not going to have those police. What is it that we're going to add? And so I think that's the fundamental question. Are we going to have more counselors? Are we going to have more social workers? Are we going to have more psychologists to help with the social, emotional, and mental health needs that kids will bring? That's one of the first things I think needs to happen. I think the second thing we want to think about is the nature of the curriculum. What is it that kids are exposed to? What are they learning? Part of the anger that I have experienced with students at the college level is that they feel like they've been lied to. When I expose them to some of the when you want to talk about school desegregation, they think, oh, that's in the South. When I show them some of the northern behaviors, they're like, well, why didn't anybody tell us this? Why don't we know this? And so I think we want to be able to tell more honest and complex histories in a post-pandemic world. And I also think we want to think about the possibility of schools beyond, or education beyond school buildings. We've been running these sort of parallel after school things. You mentioned in my introduction that I sit on some boards. So I'm the chairman of the board of the Urban League in Greater Madison, but I'm also on the board of the Madison Children's Museum. And I'm trying to get these entities to realize they have a role to play right now. The Children's Museum, if we're, you know, one of the things we're talking about in terms of going back to school is not having everybody go back, you know, that have smaller class size. So people maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday schedules and alternating. There's a role that the Children's Museum may be able to play in supplementing students' education. We've already got, with the Urban League, we've run getting ready to run a third, parent academies to teach parents how to work these devices and how to help their students with the virtual learning. I am also in the midst, and that's probably what that phone call was about, of setting up what I'm calling a school without walls. It's kind of like learning pods for some of the poorest kids in our city, where I'm doing grades 1 through 5, small groups, no more than 10 kids at a time, with tutors, not to supplant schooling, because we do have virtual schooling, but to help provide that support through those devices that a parent who's been working all day is too tired to come home and work with. So these are things that I think we can keep going. We don't have to say, oh, well, we'll just go back to normal and we don't have to do this anymore. I think the community is realizing it has more resources than it thought, and it's going to need to use those resources.
We also have had a lot of votes for a question about the school to prison pipeline. And specifically, what do you feel teachers can do about the school to prison pipeline and the disproportionate incarceration of Black children in both juvenile detention or as adults?
So I think people, you know, really aren't aware of how quickly this process begins. I've been asked a couple times to come give the, quote, commencement address at our local, at our county facility. Oakwood Correctional Institution sits right outside of Madison. And the commencement address is when someone, you know, when we get a group of students who complete the requirements for their GED or their HSED, or even if they get a certificate. So they may do a certificate in horticulture. That particular warden really wants to celebrate that level of accomplishment. So they have a commencement, they're in cap and gowns, they can invite family members, and they have a speaker. And I've been asked to be that speaker a couple times. And I always start with the same question to the students: raise your hand if at any time during your K-12 experience you were suspended. And each time I've asked that question, I've had 100% of the hands in the air. And we begin to talk about how already designating you as, you know, ripe for exclusion is putting you on that path. As a middle school teacher, I just didn't believe in suspension. So I was a middle school teacher in Philadelphia, and I remember having a principal who came up to see me in my room, and he said, you know, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, you haven't suspended anybody. And I'm like, that's a problem, you know? But he was talking about, given the population that we have, everybody suspended somebody, and I hadn't suspended anybody. So I said to him, I said, well, the truth is, I actually have suspended somebody, but I haven't referred anybody. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, if I refer them to you, then I'm taking my hands off of it, and you get to do whatever you want to do with them. And that may not really sit well with me. What you may decide is they get to go home for 3 days. And back then it was to watch cartoons, not to do video games. And I was like, if there's anybody in this situation who should get the reward of watching cartoons, it's me. And I love cartoons. I want to see the Road Runner myself. I said, no, when students commit an infraction in my class, they are suspended, but that suspension means not that they go home, but they actually spend more time here. They spend more time with me. It means that I actually come and pick them up in the morning, and they come early because I'm one of the first people in the building. It means that they spend their breaks with me. So at lunchtime, if they don't show back up in my room, I come down to the cafeteria searching for them. And I said, you know, you and I have a date. And of course, it's embarrassing in front of your friends. And they were like, what you doing here, man? And I'm like, tell them what's going on. We go back to my room, and we actually have really good conversations about what got them in that situation. And then they have a longer school day because I don't leave when the bell rings. And I take them home. trust me, after 2 days of this, you don't want to do any more infractions. But what I've conveyed to you is that I'm bringing you in, I'm not pushing you out. It really is the whole point. Back then, I didn't have a name for it, but now it's probably what we think of as restorative justice. The idea that, you know, you have to at least be able to face the harm that you've committed and own up to it, but that it doesn't exclude you from the circle. You're not put out of the circle, you're drawn in. When we start excluding people, we are already telling them they don't belong. And that is a part of that pipeline that we just decide we're not going to deal with this person. And I think most teachers don't realize it starts really early. It starts when you put them in the corner. It starts when you decide that they have to be detained. It starts when you suspend them, and certainly when you expel them.
I have a question about critical consciousness, and particularly in the situation we're in now. How do we evoke critical consciousness from our students without furthering a sense of hopelessness? As a learner myself, the more I know about the historical significance of my own place in the world, the more hopelessness I feel. How do we balance giving students a voice while also inspiring them to enter these violent, hostile environments?
So I think I talked about this earlier with one of our small groups, and I really want to emphasize that critical consciousness is not a license for the teacher to push an agenda. The things that are worrying you are not necessarily what's worrying kids. A critical consciousness needs to be developed around an issue that the students care about. And I gave the example in a smaller group of high schools that have hat rules. I don't really care about hats, not one way or the other, but for some reason, it's a big deal to students. And what the big deal is not about wearing the hat so much as it is the inequitable application of the rule, that some people get sanctioned for it and some people don't. And so rather than just say that's what's going on, the teacher who worked with her students around the quote hat rule made them get the data. You know, what she said, you're telling me stuff anecdotally that this happened to you, but didn't happen to so-and-so. She divided the class into 4. So one group had to survey freshmen, 1 sophomores, 1 juniors, 1 seniors, series of questions about whether or not someone had been stopped, sanctioned, suspended, detained, or just let go. And they looked at their race, their gender, what was likely to happen. And they were able to sort of map out a pattern that indeed, if you were Black and male, you were going to be sanctioned more often than any other group. That was a critical consciousness for the students because they had data in front of them about something they care about. It's not the same thing as deciding, oh, I'm really upset about George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, so let's deal with this. That's your agenda. Now, if that comes from students, then you have to figure out ways to deal with that. But I think that a lot of times we think critical consciousness are those things we care most about. We care about the environment. I had an example of a student in an elementary school that I was supervising, and she was very much an environmentalist. And so she had structured a project in which the students were to collect aluminum cans. And then once they got the cans, they were going to come up with a plan for what they would do with the money that came from turning the cans in. And in the middle of the project, she heard one of her students say, and these were 2nd and 3rd graders, I think it was a 2-3 combination class, and one of the kids said, yeah, you know, my dad does this every day. This is how we get money. And so she was mortified because she's sending out 20 little people to go get cans that this one family usually gets. So she was, you know, a very smart young woman. She pivoted. She said, you know what, whatever cans you collect, we're going to collect them for Mr. So-and-so, but we're going to have Mr. So-and-so come in and talk to us about what he does. And so she turned the lesson into having that parent explain can collecting and just really the volume of aluminum cans he has to collect to make any money, it's not a very lucrative kind of thing. And then the kids presented him with all the cans they had collected thus far. That to me is, you know, represented some of the best of what I'm trying to get students to do. She moved from her agenda, which was, oh, I want to do this environmental thing and let's collect cans, to realizing that this was impacting one of her students directly, and then bringing that parent in kind of as an expert to talk about where he looked to find them, how many he had to turn in each week to be able to get any kind of money, where the recycling places were. So that's what I mean by critical consciousness. It's not always the big splashy headline. I think I might have put on some of my social media posts yesterday that anybody who studied US government with me, please do not watch this debate. I mean, normally I would be telling them, please watch it. Sometimes the big splashy things are the worst things for our kids to encounter, that they have a very close to home issue that they want to deal with. And that's what we have to be attuned to. And that's part of what that social emotional learning is, you know, what's really bothering kids at this point. It's actually something that I learned in the midst of my dissertation, which I did a million years ago. My dissertation really didn't focus on pedagogy as much as curriculum, but it looked at the National Assessment of Educational Progress used to give a citizenship test. It stopped giving it after 1976, I think. And I used the released exercises from that 76 test. And one of the questions on there is, what's the most important news event? And all of the Black kids that took this test, quote, got it wrong based on the answer key. Because the answer was the Iran hostage crisis. What I did that the National Assessment doesn't do and doesn't have the capacity to do is, not only did I have students take the test, I interviewed each and every one of them. I had 75 subjects in this project. I interviewed all of them as to why they gave the answers they gave. The answer that our students gave over the most important news event was the Atlanta child murders. It wasn't the Iran hostage crisis. And then when I posed the question to them, I said, well, you know, they're saying, the test makers say it's the Iran hostage crisis. Why didn't you choose that? Students said, they let all the Black people go. And that was true. So if the test is really about, are you paying attention to the news? Yes, they are. And they saw that Jesse Jackson went to Iran and that all the Black hostages were released. So the students were like, no, we're on to this other thing that could directly impact us, where they don't know who's killing these kids. So again, it's a question of, what are the things that are plaguing the kids? What are the issues they want to deal with?
So I wondered if you would comment in any way, taking this notion of a hard reset, what are the implications for higher education right now?
Oh, wow. Well, you know, higher education is an interesting beast, because we want to make some analogies to higher education that are not appropriate. Here in the state of Wisconsin, since we are I used to say we were a state assisted school, when you look at this very small portion of our revenue that comes from our state, it's even gone down. So now I refer to us as a state located school. We are definitely located in this state. But in terms of any money from the state, hardly any. And so one of the things that the legislature always wants the chancellors to do is treat the university like a business, right? And one of my chancellors said to me, he says, I can't do that. I have to try to explain to them, if you want me to treat it like a business, it's really 10 businesses. I got a medical school, I got a college of agriculture and life sciences, I got letters and sciences, I got an education school, I got a law school, and they're all competing for this same pot. It's not one entity if you want to treat it like a business. And the legislature doesn't, quote, get that. And so I think that's the challenge that higher ed is up against, it's not one thing, it's not one entity, it is multiple entities trying to work together. And then, you know, the two biggest sort of headaches for most major universities are athletics and hospitals. And they have an inordinate impact, for good or ill, on the institution. You know, you get a bad medical suit, it can destroy lots of things. You know, I mentioned having gone to Morgan State. I can tell you, as a student at Morgan State, people used to say if they were going to go out and get drunk and have a great time and maybe end up in the hospital, they would say, and whatever you do, don't take me to Hopkins. Okay, so that's the legacy that Johns Hopkins had in the Black community. That no, don't take me to Hopkins. So I think it's really hard for universities to, they're not nimble. It's like turning an ocean liner. It's really, really hard. And until we get some really, you know, I think, creative leadership, you're not going to see a huge difference in what they're doing. Right now, the cost of education is skyrocketing, and people are asking the question whether or not it's worth it. Places like Wisconsin, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Berkeley, Michigan, they have become what we call public Ivies. Because if you actually look at the per capita income of our freshman class, it's something like $127,000. Now that's averaging even the students on aid. So it's, you know, we have a lot of rich kids who we are serving. And, you know, I don't think that the state was ever set up that way. I said to the chancellor once, I can't imagine that in the late 1840s, the farmers of Wisconsin said, hey, let's make us a school for rich people's kids. This school is not accessible to folks that don't make much money. And I think that until higher education figures out its financing, it's going to be hard to pivot. It's going to be hard to reset.
No. I think that was kind of you to use the past tense in talking about Hopkins' legacy. Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions that touch on preparing teachers in this context. And one you, I guess, said earlier in the presentation, you talked about teachers not being prepared to teach students of color in STEM areas. So that person asked, how can teachers in these communities be more prepared to teach students there? And then we also had a more general question. How would you speak to how the current teacher education system contributes to the education debt, and what needs to be done if we are going to reimagine education?
Okay, so let me take the first part about teachers being underprepared. And this is not my data. This data is from the work of folks like Linda Darling-Hammond and the Quality Education of Minority Task Force, that essentially says if you are Black or Latinx and attend a school with Black and Latinx students, you are much more likely to have a teacher in mathematics or science that is not credentialed in that area. So you'll have somebody who maybe has a biology degree, and they teach 3 or 4 periods of biology, but the administrator has an algebra class over here and essentially says, can I assign you to that? I mean, one of the reasons why we have the turnover that we have is that people are assigned the stuff that they're not prepared to teach. That's actually how the systems keep having the churn that they have. So I don't know, until we can make it attractive to teach in East Baltimore, how we're going to get people who will want to go there, who are highly skilled. I had a student who was a fully certified physics teacher. He finished his master's with me and he went back to Trenton, New Jersey. He had, within 24 hours, 7 job offers, most of them in the suburbs. and he decided to take one in the city of Trenton, which nobody would think he should take. He wanted to. He said, you know, I don't just think it's not fair that these kids don't get somebody who really knows physics. Now, unfortunately, he didn't have a fully staffed physics lab. He turned down a fully staffed physics lab in some of those other jobs, but he came up with all kinds of makeshift stuff. And for years, he would send me videos of the stuff his kids were doing and things like measuring rate of change and just trying to understand physics in an almost practical way because there were not the physics tools there. So until we're willing to invest in these schools, we're going to keep producing what we have. I think you had a second question, second part to that question. Oh, the role of teacher preparation. Well, teacher preparation is also suffering from, I think, the same thing that K-12 teacher ed is that most of our teacher educators themselves don't have experience or backgrounds that are similar to kids in K-12 education. So you have white middle-class teacher educators preparing white middle-class teachers to go into schools serving Black and Latinx and special needs students, of which they don't have very much experience. And so, you know, if you go back to Martin Haberman's model that we have to stop trying to staff our schools with, you know, 19-year-old, in his words, nubile Vestal virgins, that we really got to begin to get some people with some life experience, and that the so-called best and brightest for urban classrooms may not look at all like what we're calling the best and brightest. Maybe the best and brightest for an urban classroom is somebody who themselves have had to move in the middle of the month, or someone themselves who have had a car breakdown, or someone themselves who hadn't had health insurance, because they can have a level of empathy with students that other teachers may not. And so Marty had that specific urban teacher protocol that he ran candidates through. And he rarely actually had students who were under 30 years old come through his program. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have an age discrimination, but if we don't know what we're looking for, then we're going to keep having who we have. And I think we have to move out of this way of thinking that of teacher education as a cash cow, that, you know, we can keep bringing them in and, you know, pushing them through because they pay the bills, as opposed to having smaller, more focused programs that meet particular needs. One of the things I've been arguing for here in the state, and I've argued it before my board of regents, is that we actually need an urban certificate, not just calling it the urban teacher education program, but a certification that says this person has a unique set of experiences and skills to make them qualified to teach in urban areas.
Well, thank you very much. We've hit 7:30, and I know this is the fourth event we've had you do today. So
yes, and I have to head off to one of my former students' classes in North Carolina. So I'm glad we're actually ending on time. He sent me a late invitation, so I'm going to run over there. So thank you so much. Next time you and I are going out for crab cakes.
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
I've got a favorite place right by Morgan State. So
you got a favorite place? Okay, good.
all right. Well, thank you so much. I know that there would be applause right now, but I don't even think that people have access to the little clapping hands.
The reaction button. Okay.
But, I do want to thank you. I want to thank my fellow chairs, and I want to thank the Dean of the School of Education for making this possible, Chris Morphew. And I want to thank all of our participants for coming out on a Wednesday night. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. So long now.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.